I'm delighted to introduce another absolutely accomplished gentleman, George. George is the managing director of and the group head of operational risk at Barclays. He is the senior most operational risk executive globally at Barclays and is delivering the future of operational risk management and has talked a lot about how resilience is becoming more and more critical, and that's the topic of the day with him today. George has a very eclectic background. He's been the Chief Information Security Officer at Comerica Synchrony and a global executive in security at Morgan Stanley and EY, and has served as an advisor to the Clearinghouse, to Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council, and the Department of Homeland Security. So very deep. Notably, he also contributed significantly to the development of the financial services cybersecurity profile and is a recognized thought leader on cyber frameworks, privacy, and harmonization. A lot of board experiences as well. So George, welcome, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Hey, our first test of the mic, it's actually working.
Yes.
Hey, it's good to meet everybody. Thank you for having me. Hopefully we can make this a little energizing and forward-looking for everyone. We got a good set of questions, so get it started.
So first thing, personally, George, I'm very curious. So I interact with a lot of chief information security officers that traditionally have been very focused on security, if you will, right? But seeing your transition going from such a deep security background and becoming the operational risk head for Barclays that has so many other risks that are associated with it, would love to know a little bit about that journey and how that transition happened and how it's happening.
Yep. So I'm going to do this in two ways. One is a little bit about me, but a little bit about how the profession has evolved. And I'm not the first CISO to move up to the top. Goldman Sachs did the same. I think the same thing's happening at Capital One and a few others. But, I've been coding since 5th grade, so I'm a techie. I did a JD MBA, and then I got into tech and strategy and run apps, and then data, security, and op risk. And the things that I've learned is for any of you that are in security, you have to know it's a risk discipline, okay? It is a risk discipline in every way you look at it. So as my career grew, I took on broader responsibilities beyond security because of the integrated nature. I have put in privacy programs. I have run tech risk. I have run resilience, which was really BC, business continuity, and DR. Back then, I have run information lifecycle management and all the data stuff as well, and had the chief data officer reporting up to me. Putting those together, so what really happened was, if you think about when the first security person came out, which was first CISO, Richard Katz, Citi, 1997. Still a mentor that I literally used to talk to monthly. Now we're down to about quarterly. When that all came about, and we built out the Financial Services Information Sharing Analysis Center, the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council. That's all right. We know the mic works. The idea that it is going to turn into a major risk discipline, that was always my side. You will meet CISOs who are super deep in tech. I'm deep enough. I'm come at it more from a risk point of view, and that breadth comes out. So what's happened is the world has gotten really hard. And especially for the big organizations, CISOs have to be very, very technical. The bad guys, and we're going to talk a little bit about it technologically. But I think that when you build your path, you have to expand your risk domain to be able to talk to boards, to be able to talk to executives, and to talk to customers. And that's actually one of the challenges why it's about resilience today. So that's how I came into the role. Because think about it. You guys all bank. What do the biggest operational risk banks have? Resilience, cybersecurity, technology, change. Those are the big ones. Now, in banking, yes, we got to make sure we pay people. We got to clear your trades. There's actually a lot of operations too, but it's all tech. Anyway, let's get moving on some of the resilience stuff.
So this whole concept of integrated risk has been talked about and being done by organizations for quite some time now. And even with all the speed and velocity we talked about earlier as well, George, resilience seems to be a big word now, especially in the last year or so. How do you define resilience in your opinion? I know the PRA, for example, was one of the first regulators in UK to come and say that you need to have a formal resilience program. It's partially prescriptive, partially descriptive, if you will. And then it's been followed by other regulators as well now. But how do you define resilience?
Yep. So if you guys will humor me for a little bit, resilience is always on today. And we're actually not, resilience almost is an old term. I think we're emerging into an era of hyper-resilience, customer expectations that we've never seen before. For me, resilience is bringing all the component parts that we've been building for years into making an organization that serves our customers and stays always on. So one of the talks, that I do is to think back about how we have developed in terms of expectations and resilience, especially with technology. And I go back, if you think back in the decades, we've seen this growth. 1980s is probably about when cheap compute came in, right? When we had Dell, we had Gateway, we had all the things that came in there. And that was really the era of identifying that we had assets and that compute was going to be completely built into how we start to do business. That's when it started. Then you got into the idea that we had viruses. We had things that could break down this new great computer thing. We had the I Love You virus. We had Conflicker. We lived in a world of antivirus software and Norton and McAfee, et cetera. That's really what we dealt with in the 90s, right? And that was, think of that as the era of detect. Then we hit the internet age around the dawn of the 2000s, around the dawn of it. We all had our pets.com accounts. Well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. But what was happening there was this massive network effect, right? Where you had to know what you were protecting and what was keeping on. And we were so distributed in our organizations in that the internet and then shortly thereafter the cloud hit. And that was around the 2000s. And I think that was the identify. At that point, we had more trouble figuring out where our assets were and what they were that we had to protect and enable than anything else. Then we got into the fact that we started to see major hits on infrastructure. This happened in, around the early 2000s, 2010s. You had Sony. You had the Facebook failures. You had Equifax. Major customer breaches, and we learned that we had to respond. Now what's happening, in the era of ransomware, cyber warfare, breakdowns, we're in a recover mode. And if you take the identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, and you put those together, that's really where you get to resilience. It's about making all those things work together to keep the whole organization up. So you mentioned PRA. Many of you probably operate in global organizations. Some of you don't. The PRA is the Prudential Regulatory Authority in the UK. And they're a little further ahead on resilience than some of the other regulators in the US. The US is very much technology. They'll say all the right words, but it really comes down to disaster recovery and business continuity. There, what they've done is they've introduced some concepts that I think are leading and are going to take us to the next area. So the first is they've made all businesses identify important business services. Now, you may think in terms of, well, that's your end-to-end processes. It's not that far off. In business, it's things like completing application for a credit card, running a transaction for a credit card. And what they want you to do is identify all of those important business services. Now, most of us have risk tolerance statements. And I'm going to get into what that means a little bit too. You will have risk appetite, you will have tolerance. What they have said is that we would like you to identify periods of intolerable harm against the customer. And to do that, you have to have your, what's the terminology they use? It's escaping me. So it's intolerable harm is the customers, and then they want the impact limits. So a little bit, it's like what you said in BCDR, but it's a little worse. So what they've told us is, look, you have your risk appetite that you deal with. But then you have to have, well, when does your customer hit intolerable harm? And then what are those important business services that have to be kept up? And then build that prioritization into what it takes to run it through. And that's where you get to the always on. That's where you get to the recoverability in a meaningful way. And we're going to talk a little bit about it and how to do that technologically. But that's the direction that we're all going around customers, always on, and that's the resilience. And if you think about identify, protect, respond, recover, those all have to happen concurrently. You have to have an event, an outage, and at the same time you have to keep servicing your customers. And that's what resilience is about.
George, one of the pickups from what you just said, given the wide nature of resilience, just last week I was actually moderating a panel in UK with State Street and Lloyds Bank and London Stock Exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost looked like, a big debate was how should organizations set up the organization for resilience? Should it be under op risk? Should it be under the CO? Should it be under somebody else?
Yeah.
Because it cuts across so many themes. And everybody seemed to have a different opinion on that panel. Not very different, but different enough.
Mm-hmm.
What's your opinion on how the optimal organization for managing resilience?
So going forward, there are two trends that I think are really important here. And I have a pretty strong point of view on this one. First off, how you manage resilience has to be in the first line of defense. Typically within an operations, or if you have a president in your company, something that sits across. Your resilience team doesn't do the work. It drives the standards and the expectations of the organization and gives them the guardrails of how to get it done. But it has to sit centrally. It has to sit across your security organization, your technology organization, your third-party risk organization, right? And it has to pull together those standards. The second piece, though, is an evolution. So we talked a little bit about cyber to op risk. I think, and this is something that is hard, easy to say, really hard to do. Risk managers are going to become infinitely more important. Not because they're enabling risk and helping people solve it, but I believe they're going to transition from being an organization that reviews and challenges and identifies risk to one that controls risk. And they're going to put consequences out there on what's expected of the business. So you need both that first line that does it, as well as the second line that answers the so what. So if you're not doing it, who is limiting the business and giving them consequences for not being able to satisfy that? I mean, everybody gets worried about it, but the bottom line is if you're not limiting the business and not putting in your teeth, they're not going to change. It's not a popularity contest. Yes, we all work for the same company, but it's going to require a level of strength and skills that hasn't existed. So to answer your question organizationally, I think it has to sit in the front line and a part of the organization that spans, and you need a risk organization that has teeth. And I mean meaningful teeth with credibility and strength. And I got to tell you, there are very few organizations that are doing this today. And it doesn't always sit well with me. It's friggin' hard, right? When you're dealing with the CEO and telling him you can't grow this business because you're not going to be resilient enough. That takes a lot to do, but that's what is going to drive success and resilience. If we just keep checking the box and rolling around and identifying the risk and saying how hard it is, we're not going to get to the next level. And once you have quantum computing coming out, once you have AI coming out, once you have your replatforming of your business, they're going to all say, where was risk, right? And I think that's going to be the driving forces on how we need to organize.
No, thank you. We'll keep a couple of minutes for questions at the end. I know there's some hands being raised. One thing that relates to that, one of my most interesting, you talked about impact tolerance testing, etc., right? One of the most interesting fireside chats I've had in the last 10 years in a summit was actually with Nicholas Taleb, who was the author of Black Swan and Anti-Fragile. And in that interview or discussion, he talked about a concept as early as 7-8 years ago about anti-fragility, where organizations should probably give shocks to the system to test resilience. Now, real shocks can be very expensive to actually simulate. It's different from scenario analysis, but how do you think about simulating shocks to test the system, and what are the right strategies from a program perspective organizations should put in place?
So this is, I'm going to take this direction a little bit into the interconnectedness you brought up and the connected risk. You know, it's fascinating that you asked that. Many people here, when you get into the esoteric operational risks and cyber risks, I don't want to say that, I shouldn't use the word esoteric, but you know, it's in some ways a lot harder than credit risk, market risk, other areas where you can have limits. Like, you guys all have spending limits. Everybody has that in procurement. Just set the limit. You can't go above it, you can't go under it. That's much harder to do in the multivariable world that we live in. So one of the things that people always come to me is like, well, you know, what is the value add of the risk you're implementing? You know, how do I quantify it? And, you know, it's like, so let's think about it. How should we quantify the firewalls that organizations have? Let's turn them off and find out, right? Your organization won't exist. You will get to enterprise value, which gets to the testing piece. How do you test in those worlds, right? You have to do, it is so expensive. What are you going to do? Run two companies so that if one fails, one has a problem, you roll over to the other? You can't do that. We'll talk a little bit about technology. So I do believe in that, in the tabletops, the testing, make it as real as it gets, because then you have both the intellectual and the emotional response to what's happening. So I think that was a great concept. So let's talk about what we do in terms of, like, you know, short of shutting down the company, turning off the firewalls and seeing what happens. What are some of the things that we do? So many of you, and hopefully all of you, have a very good risk framework. And part of that risk framework is a risk taxonomy. If you're like 99% of the organizations, it probably has your principal risk around strategic risk, legal risk, financial risk, operational risk, hopefully. And then you have the next level down, which would be like cyber, technology, data, et cetera. The challenge with that is you just get into this whole, you're now violating what we just talked about. You're starting to think about risks in siloed areas. So I actually think you need it. You know, and the reason you need that kind of a framework, before I tell you how to like augment it to make it work, is I don't know if we have any fans of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy out here. One of my favorite parts of that movie is the babblefish. That's the fish you stick in your ear, because we all do that, but it's the universal translator of all languages around the galaxy. To me, that's what frameworks provide. They get the organization on a common language, they give them the parameters by which they operate, and they let you actually run at scale. But unfortunately, traditional frameworks aren't going to be enough, and I think you need to augment them. So some of the concepts that we've been driving, use interconnected risk. We have concept of connected risk. And I think there are two ways. You need to run an overview of a connected risk lens that goes across your taxonomy on relevant areas. And I think that comes in two ways. One is sometimes it's just a reporting lens. Others, it's how you manage risk. So let's think about third-party risk. Many of you probably have supplier management organizations. And many frameworks will, and almost all frameworks, will think of supplier risk as how well you manage that supplier's risk and performance. But we all know that they have cyber risk, they have technology risk, they have operational risk, they have resilience, they have all that other stuff. How do you bring that together in a framework with supplier managers that are not SMEs in all of those other areas? You can give them questionnaires. I'm sure we all get those Excel spreadsheets. So what you do with a connected risk at a reporting lens is you demand and bring together the resilience of those components together and looking at supplier risk. And then you complement that with a risk organization that has approval authority for your material suppliers. No, I don't think we care where you buy your paper from, but we do care where you're running your operations. And if those suppliers can't meet those needs, you have to have the teeth not to do it, and we have to drive it. That's one way of thinking about bringing your framework together through a connected risk. The other way is actually in how to manage risk. How many of you have fraud in your organization? Hopefully everybody. At least insider fraud, if nothing else, and payments. Big deal in financial services. How does fraud happen today? Yes, people call, they pretend to be you, but a lot of it's cyber-enabled fraud. So one of the other way to drive a connected risk is actually in how you manage it. And I called out one of my favorite examples is cyber-enabled fraud. If your fraud groups and your cyber groups aren't tied at the hip in terms of how they're learning, preventing day one, responding day two, identifying fraud trends, et cetera, that won't be effective. So when you think about the connectedness of the risk, you have to build that into your framework. And you can't do it everywhere because you'll die on the machine. You have to have a prioritization of saying, what are the most important risks that I have? Where do I need reporting lenses? And where do I have to actually manage them in an integrated fashion? I think that's where the best organizations are taking how to manage resilience. And then, I dropped in the word resilience. That's what it drives to, is when you can connect those risks, you can drive resilience as long as you can prioritize where it needs to go.
Well, thanks, George. And that takes me to the next question. I mean, we've been working with Barclays for the last 7-8 years, but last couple of years, you've been attempting to bring a transformation on how resilience and risk is managed. And we talked a little bit about the 3 C's: continuous, cloud, cognitive.
Mm-hmm.
How do you look at technology being leveraged to bring value to the program?
Yeah, so the technology is interesting. And by the way, I inherited I'm not allowed to talk about Barclays, but yeah, we are doing a great job in getting caught up to where we should have been all along, right? But let me bring this up in terms of kind of both the idea of protect and enable. I think that we are going to hit a stage of resilience where the basics are expected. You have to have good hygiene. That means your systems have to be patched, they have to work, they have to be concurrent, they have to be current on patching levels, they have to be connected. That's expected. Like, that's ticket to entry. If you're having trouble patching your systems, no matter what you do with the cloud, you're just going to transport all that stuff to other systems. So you have to also have good orchestration. I loved the example of risks that I think within a couple of minutes get entered into your GRC system. I mean, that's phenomenal. Now, a lot of people do that in technology, but to really think of it from a risk, that's a step ahead. But that is all kind of ticket to entry. Then get into how you architect. You talked about cloud. So what is the advantage of cloud? And that is the failover that it gives you, right? The fact that you can build in a level of resilience, both in zones as well as data centers, right? I'm thinking AWS as, the big Virginia, California, and the failover. And you have to get to that level of resilience so that you have automatic failover and distributed compute in order to stay always on. But then you have to manage the risk around that. Unfortunately, we live in a world that physics still matters, okay? So if I go and put everything out to the edge, you might say, hey, that's great. I'm out in AWS, I'm in Oracle, I'm wherever you want to be, Google Cloud, and you've got everything at your fingerprints out there, except for the truth of the matter is it's not really everywhere around the globe. Hell, it can't be in China. They require it all to be locked in there. So what happens when that East Coast center goes away? What is your real cost in managing the data that you have in your East Coast center to your failover in the West Coast center? Physics matters. It costs. You cannot copy that amount of data out that fast. So you can run it totally redundant, but the cost gets crazy. So you have to architect in ways where your crown jewels are absolutely protected. You minimize data at the front end, but you do it through tokenization. You do it through proxies. You do it through different ways, because if it's all sitting out there, you really will not, you'll solve one problem, but you'll create another one. So architecture, the data model, how you manage the core things, and you want your systems to call in and auto-generate your IDs, auto-generate, each of the one transactions. Because in order to do it, if you want that redundant and failover, you have to build that kind of an architecture. It's really hard. It's really expensive. And then when you get into some of the regulated areas, you have to make some decisions as to how much do you want to trust your third party, as well as how much do you want to host yourself. And basically build the same architecture and solve the same problems, but at least you have a little more control over the data. So when you think about the architecture of it, I think cloud is enabled. I think the orchestration that we talked about, it has to be at athletic speed. And then I'll finish the last one. This goes back to my cyber roots. We are hitting an era of machine versus machine, okay? Yes, I know we're concerned about AI, but let's face it, this stuff has been out there for a long time. If you have human beings responding to attacks that are systematically probing, breaking down, and using the law of large numbers, where you're only as good as your weakest link, you're going to probably lose that race. You have to develop machine versus machine. If the bad guys are developing AI to break it down, you better have AI. You know, like in the banking system, one of the things that keeps me up, and I'll get out of tech on this, is when is the first person going to deploy AI to cause a market disruption? It goes beyond algo. You know, right now we worry about algorithms that have runaway algorithms, and you have like, you know, the flash crashes and some of the things to the market. Well, imagine an AI system that gets out there that's some hedge fund, and then, you know, US highly regulated. The market, you talked about London Stock Exchange earlier. I walk by them every day when I go to work in London. Those are the things we got to worry about. And this is why, remember when I said organizationally, I think the pressure on risk organizations is higher than ever. If your tech risk lead cannot be your CIO, then your tech risk lead is probably not good enough. If your cyber risk lead can't be your CISO, then your cyber lead is not good enough. And if your person running the business and operations and banking for us, it couldn't run that in the front line, then they're probably not good enough. And that is not the error that I am seeing in risk. And I think to get to that level of hyper-resilience, there's going to have to be a delivery of medicine that's going to have to happen. And your organizations, your CEOs will have to support that. And it's not going to be easy. Trust me, it's not easy. I've had those calls today. But that's where I think the tech is going. And, you know, yes, I'm really excited about, and by the way, you talked a little bit about Barclays' journey. You know, I wanted us to be evergreen. You roll out something, it flows through. The practicalities of the world is we will be, what do we call it? Upgrade safe. We will be upgrade safe. So it won't flow through immediately like it does with Microsoft Office. But we have to do that because, you know, that requires a lot of design on MetricStream part as well as Barclays part to make it come together. And I think that's how you have to approach everything. Don't customize yourself into a hole anywhere. Anyway, that's my view on the tech side.
No, thank you, George. And we have just a couple of minutes, you know, and George has to leave earlier. So if you want to interact with him, you know, in the next hour, hour and a half, but he does have to leave today. One last piece of, you know, very simplistically, one last piece of advice on this whole movement from risk to resilience for the audience.
So I think we've talked a lot about organizationally. I'm going to answer it both personally and organizationally. Personally, you know, we opened a little bit about how I got here. It was early in my career when I went to work, and we were just going through like Windows 3.1 to 7 to XP, you know, all that. And I looked at some of my coworkers, and I saw them just being curmudgeons, like, oh, I don't want to do the new stuff. I like the way it old is. And I told myself that would never be me. If it's new, I'm embracing it. I know it better than my kids. I know how it works. You know, no, I don't use TikTok, but I've used it. And I know how it works. You have to embrace the future of tech, okay? The world is going to keep changing. And the best personal advice I can give everyone is always embrace the future. It's coming one way or another. And then adapt it to all the experience that you have within it. Don't be a curmudgeon. It's the only way to keep up with where we're going.
Thank you, George. And we have this topic, you know, has been quite front of mind for a lot of organizations, like George and both spoke about. It started intensively in Europe. We also have some other resources. Michael Rasmussen is sitting right here. You know, he's an independent analyst. Ala from Forrester, they write and talk to a lot of organizations around resilience. So just as I mentioned in my keynote, take the opportunity to speak to each other, and we'll be on that journey. Thank you. Thank you, George.
Thank you, everyone.